Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show. This week we are looking at property. Specifically, we are looking at the primary place of residence. Everybody needs somewhere to live. Better yet, if you can own it yourself and add some value, that starts you well and truly on the journey into making money. Make sure you take plenty of notes, but as always, please do take plenty of action. See you in the show. Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show with me, your host, Andrew Baxter, and as always, my offsider and co-host, Mitchell Laurential.
Thanks for having me on the show, Mr. Baxter. Love the fit today, looking awfully vibrant there. Speaking of which, we're going to chat about the biggest store of wealth in Australia right now, and that is the principal place of residence. So,
I thought you were going to talk about my wife's clothing collection.
Yeah, not quite. That's the second biggest, don't get me wrong. We're going to talk about how to select one, what to look out for, and of course your experience along that investing journey, even though it is not necessarily a money-making journey, so to speak, a principal place of residence. There is great opportunity for some great gains.
Absolutely. And yeah, when you take a step out of it, your primary place of residence, PPR as it's referred to in the game, I think for most people is probably their biggest financial decision that they ever have to make. It's also the biggest store of wealth for many Australians. It's also the source, unfortunately, at times for the biggest level of stress. So it does cover a myriad of different emotions and benchmarks, I think, for life. And so we can explore some of them and give people a bit of a guideline on what to do, what not to do, why to do it. Hopefully it assuages it. But property is just a phenomenon in itself when you consider that 66, 67% of Australians own a property. The current median price in Australia of a property is $860,000.
That's a lot, isn't it? Median.
And it starts to then give you an idea of the actual quantum of the trillions of dollars that are locked up in our domestic property market.
Now, you strike me as someone who's probably fairly seasoned in the home buying space. You've moved countries, you've moved cities, you now live on a farm in Byron Bay. How many homes have you owned personally, if you can remember off the top of your head?
Primary place of residence?
Yeah.
I think we're just totting it up. I reckon about maybe 14, I think.
That's a lot of boxes to move 14 times.
Absolutely. It is, and it gets harder as there are more moving parts, that's for sure. So yeah, it is a very difficult decision for a lot of people. It's emotional, it involves money and emotion are two things for most people, I think, that are inextricably linked. And I guess when you're buying your home, let's face it, you have to have somewhere to live. And that's the overarching reason for buying somewhere is you have to have somewhere to live. And yet the modern sort of spin, I say modern, I'm starting to sound like an old man when I say that. The modern sort of spin is that it's actually the money-making machine because, on balance, most people probably make more money tax-free from their primary place of residence, appreciating in value than anything else. So it garners a lot of attention because of that. The challenge is that if you sell your property because you want to lock in a profit, well, you've got to buy back into the market again. So you're really selling and buying in the same market. So it's kind of almost a juxtaposition because if your property's gone up in value substantially and you're taking some cash off the table with it, and then you're buying into the market again, you're paying more for what you're buying into. So
let's flesh that out a little bit. So as you say, you've got to have somewhere to live. And when you're buying somewhere to live, it's got to be the right location. And I will go through the criteria in a moment's time. But you mentioned the notion that it's tax-free, so no CGT, no land tax. Is that correct?
No capital gains tax and no land tax. And if you own your house and you rent it for a period of time, I think it's 2 years and 6, you're allowed to rent it out as an investment property if it's still your primary place of residence to avoid any of your accountant will better advise you on that sort of thing. So it can be a very, very tax effective place to grow your wealth. And that opens the door for an awful lot of approaches that people take. And we'll talk about things like renovation and value add in a few moments. But I guess it really comes down to two things. Are you buying your home? And this is very different from a conversation around investment property. If you're buying your own home, are you buying it to make money or are you buying it to have a quality of life? Or it could be both.
Could be both?
Could be both. So you can lean probably more towards one thing or another. We've got to have somewhere to live. That's a human need. But if you can make a few bucks alongside that, then that's a win-win situation for you. And it's how a lot of people do get their start in life in terms of acquiring wealth by buying well and going through the process that we're going to outline, and it sets you up.
Well, let's do that now. What is the process? Can we break it up into a couple of categories that you might want to assess?
Look, I think you can look at, let's break it down into maybe three core areas. Location, which whenever you talk about property, obviously location is very, very important. Affordability and functionality. It's all well and good having something that's in a great location, but if you can't afford it, then it's going to cause dramas in itself. And, affordability is a hugely important screen to look on things. We've all got a desire to live perhaps where our lifestyle might be, and this will vary, of course, with age. But it's whether the hip pocket can support that particular kind of lifestyle. So affordability is massively important. And
it's probably number one on the list, right? Unless you've got the ability to afford something, you've got really no flexibility to choose location or functionality in the first place, right?
Exactly right. And the bank will look at affordability in terms of your ability to service the loan. It's debt serviceability. So they're going to take a bet that the market's going to hold reasonably steady and you're going to be able to continue to pay your mortgage so that they can get their money paid back to you. And if you fail to do that, they'll repossess your property, and that's a different can of worms. But what wiggle room do you build into the fact that interest rates can change? And this, I guess, is fairly topical currently, given the fact that we're in an interest rate cycle that's rising. And it's caught a lot of people out because, our governor wouldn't be a podcast without mentioning him, Philip Lowe, Dr. Philip Lowe, made representation that rates weren't going up till 2024, which is obviously incorrect. And a lot of people base their borrowing decision on that. And when the clock turned and rates started to go up, it's caused, significant mortgage stress for people. So, and I sort of go back, and I know I've had my dad on this podcast in the past, and my dad's advice always, get your debt paid off, because if you owe people money, you never own your life, which is a very narrow-minded and old school set of values to use, and it served me pretty damn well through my life. I certainly took that on board from my dad. And I think, he always said, be conservative in what you can borrow. You can borrow more, but, you want to be able to still be able to afford to have a quality of life or do stuff as well, because if you're just chasing debt payment, it's not fun. So rather than stretch yourself and get into the market in the biggest place you can buy, get into something that you can afford, and then look to add value in different ways than just simply the organic growth in the property market. And APRA, who are the Australian Prudential Regulatory Association, they're the people that regulate our banks to all intents and purposes. I think the model that they used was at the time was about 3% over what base rates were. Yet we've already seen interest rates move way past that point. So the sort of margin they were advising people to give themselves as a buffer of 3% wasn't enough. So I'd almost go double that and say, imagine rates moving by 6%. Could you still service your debt then? And if you can, then that's affordable. And if you can't, then lower the bar and aim for something different. And that's a very conservative way of playing it. But we're not talking about an investment property here where you can use the rent to offset it. And we're not talking about being able to deduct the cost of the interest like you can in an investment property. You've got to pay for it. If it's your primary place of residence, you have to pay. It's as simple as that. And so putting yourself under financial stress to go into something that's too big or out of your league is not the way to build wealth. It'll give you ulcers and keep you up at night.
That's right. I've heard on a couple of other sources that if you are buying somewhere to live, then you should be only spending around 30% of your net take-home income on mortgage repayments. Does that sound about right?
I think that's really good advice because it is at the more conservative end of what people see. And again, it's easy to make a decision today. And property, whether it's an investment property or a primary place of residence, is a longer term window that you're looking at, and an awful lot can change over time. And it's not just a question of interest rates moving up, but your particular life circumstances can too. So something else a lot of people don't necessarily factor in at the time is if they have dependents. So if you're in you've got a husband and wife situation, you're married, you're buying your first home together, and then you decide to have a family, well, that's one person extra to support, then two, possibility that one of the parties, either the mum or dad, are going to take time off work to be at home and look after the kids, or if they go back to work, you've got to find the money for childcare. So your ability to service that debt has gone from two incomes and no fixed costs of kids to maybe one income and three dependents on there, which makes a really material difference to your ability to support your mortgage. And I remember my dad used to work around the clock. I mean, he'd work at weekends and mum was a cleaner, so she'd work in the evenings and things like that. They worked really, really hard to make sure that they were able to meet their mortgage obligations. I'm an only child. I obviously have one and hit perfection, so they needed to break the mold. But, parking that to the side for a moment, if you have a bigger family, it can become, very, very challenging.
So that's your affordability and then your functionality perspective on that, AB.
The functionality side of it is that, again, in just the same way that the affordability is going to change if you have dependents, so too does the functionality. And all of a sudden, I sort of think to my home when I met my now wife was, it was a fantastic place to live. It was also the most perfect bachelor pad. It would be manifestly unsuitable for my lifestyle now. And so, that functionality wasn't there for what my upcoming chapter of life was going to be. And always, again, go back to that view that you've got to be looking at property with that 10-year mindset in mind. What can you expect to change in that next 10 years? And how do you deal with it? Why you might think to yourself, well, I'll just sell and move into something bigger that has more bedrooms or whatever. But there is a cost of transaction in property that's pretty hefty, particularly when you factor in things like stamp duty, for example, which unfortunately is a primary place of residence you still get to pay. And so there is a switching cost of moving around. So you do want to sort of buy with a bit of growth capacity in there, where if your needs change all of a sudden, then you've got functionality in the property. And I think the pandemic was a really good example of that, where you saw people that prior to the pandemic were very happy living in a city, and who could have foreseen what was going to go on, but living in a city in an apartment. All of a sudden, if there are two people working from home in a one-bedroom apartment, you're under each other's feet all the time. You need space to be able to work from home, possibly privately or whatever it may be. And so, a house offers different benefits because, typically there's a bigger floor plan that goes with that. So again, moving in together into an apartment, that might be what you can afford. But if you're planning on having a family, then that might be a little bit more challenging. So that's a huge factor to consider.
There's a lot to consider, as you say. Now, we haven't even started on location, AB, and I know how many factors there are in location: schools, crime rates, close to medical centres you are. I mean, what other things would you consider in that case?
Well, that's right. I mean, location is the catch cry, of course.
Great TV show too, by the way.
And what you would deem to be a great location is going to vary at different times in your lifetime. The obvious one, if you've got kids, is proximity to schooling and medical facilities. And equally, as you get older, having access to medical facilities become just as important. The schools probably less so. Crime is an interesting one if you live in an inner city area. And I consider, if I look at my first purchase in London, wasn't by any stretch of the imagination the most salubrious place. It's a pretty rough end of town, and we'll get on to what sort of location to buy and what to then do. It suited my needs. I lived on my own. It's what I could afford at the time, and it was my start. And I was very fortunate in that area became gentrified. Pretty much almost immediately after, not because I moved in there, but immediately after, it started to really change in its composition from being a fairly rough end of town to being edgy, I suppose would be the softer term to describe it, to be bohemian, to being the hit spot to be. And that sort of transition, again, takes 5-10 years when you look at that in a property cycle. So crime is really important, especially if you're older. And also, depending on the type of dwelling it is, if you're in an apartment, crime is slightly different because breaking entry in a high-rise apartment is very different from a single-story dwelling. So that's a consideration too, depending on where you're at. Transport is a massive one, and it's one that I think oftentimes people overlook, and especially in a city context. So to give you a hard fact on just how important transport is, if you look at Sydney right now, and these stats can obviously vary over time, if the property is located within 400 metres of a train station, it's actually worth about 4.5% more than something that isn't.
In Sydney prices, that 4% actually adds up to quite a lot.
It certainly does. So there's a material prize value associated with that proximity to great public transport. And I reckon, and I haven't had a look at some other cities, but I reckon you'd find that's pretty much a ubiquitous global factor, is that proximity to transport. And once again, the access to transport really will mean different things to you at different stages. So maybe when you're younger, it might be public transport to get on. Think back to London, getting on the tube or the bus to get into work. And it may be as your lifestyle changes, it's the ability to good roads to be able to drive around, or if your business requires airports, and I don't fly anything like I used to, so proximity to the airport now is not a consideration for me. But when you're doing 100 flights a year plus, it's massively important. And as I said to you before, it kind of helps my next door neighbour's got a G6, so it's kind of doesn't make too much difference flying.
Yeah,
so that'd be all right.
That's nice.
But I think, airports are an example, or train stations. They're things that can be really manifestly important in terms of transport. So there are like a handful of things around the location space that I think are good screeners for people to consider. But again, you got to be looking down the line. So what's going to be important for this, not the current chapter of life you're in, but the back end of the current one and the next one that's coming, if that kind of makes sense. Because we all live in the moment. You think this is perfect for me today and now. Where am I going to be in 5 years' time? And does the decision I'm making today service where I'm going to be in maybe 3, 4, 5 years' time?
It's a really good question. And as you say, it comes down to your lifestyle at the moment and what you need or what you want, but also some money-making opportunities. So let's parlay to that now, AB, because this is the Money and Investing Show after all. So on the basis of the criteria we've presented today, you're picking somewhere that you want to live. Is there any advice in the actual money generation space on your PPR?
But I think it's critical because you've got an opportunity to have a free swing without tax. So if you've got an opportunity of making some money with it, you kind of need to do that as well in today's world. So, it comes down to, it's got to be location because it's the overarching function for any property transaction. And it's a question of buying the best location that you can afford based on what we've talked about already with affordability criteria. And if I sort of think about my wife's grandfather, Frank Foster, a great banker with the NAB back in the day, responsible for opening up a lot of rural New South Wales, very smart guy. I didn't get a chance to meet him, unfortunately. And what he said, I've heard echoed through a number of other people, and it's always buy the worst house in the best street that you can get into.
Classic advice.
And you think, okay, yeah, cliche. But when you actually step back and think about that from a practicality perspective, if you're buying in the best street that you can afford, the location is ticking the box that you want. Okay, so that's an immediate big font 50 tick in the box.
Well, it's not easy to change your location, right?
The location
so you get the right location.
Always going to be where it is. And again, you look at any kind of city, you've always got the outer suburbs that bloom the last, and the core inner city is typically what retains its value. The older suburbs, you think about Sydney, you look at Wallara and places like that. Bellevue Hill, they're right in the middle of town, albeit in the eastern suburbs, and they always hold their value. If you look at Toorak in Melbourne, it's the same. If you look at sort of Ascot in Brisbane, it's exactly the same. The old part, the hub of the town, holds its value, and everything else is the ripple effect as it goes out. So if you're buying the best house in the worst house in the best street, you're dropping anchor in what is a great location. So what do you do then with the worst house? That's where value add really comes into it. And, that notion of all the different things that you can do to enhance value, whether it's a renovation, whether it's changing the garden, putting a granny flat for multi-generational dwelling or working from home, getting some off-street car parking in play, going through the roof and putting a couple of dormer rooms up in there to have more space for kids' rooms. All of those sorts of things enable you to get more out of the footprint that you've got in that great location. And the wonderful thing about it, of course, as you add that value and you come to sell, other people hopefully will appreciate that value if you're putting stuff in that's sort of half sensible. If you've sort of gone down the Nordic spa route, that's a minority thing. Not everyone wants that, but most people would want a pool or off-street parking if they're in a city. So the stuff that's widely accepted as being popular are smart sort of additions to do to somewhere. And again, it's tax-free. The downside, and I had a former colleague that seemed to do this rather a lot, would be to buy a house and do a renovation where you're living in it. And the prospect of living in a building site for 2 or 3 years, I think I'd rather do plenty of other things in my life than that. But if that's what your strategy is to get ahead, then it's certainly possible to do that, and you get better and more efficient at doing those sorts of things. So, that idea of adding value in any way, shape, or form, you're never going to be able to change the location, but you can change the property that's on it, I think is the key advice there. And then, I guess finally to that, when you're buying it, is buy with that 10-year view in mind, that whatever it is now, with some value add, the location's already good, and if I can change this and change that, it's going to go from appealing to maybe a couple to becoming a family home, which opens the aperture, if you will, to a broader buying public. And from a money and investing perspective, even though it's your primary place of residence, if you've got something that's, I'm not going to say meat and potatoes, but something that is what most people are looking for, it's very, very easy to sell and it's very appealing. When you've got something that's quite niche or lifestyle, that becomes much harder because it becomes a very much smaller demographic that would be interested in something that's got X or something that's got Y. It's like rural living. If I take our place down at Byron, right now it suits us with 5 children, and the pathway that we're on, teaching the kids about growing food and all of the good things that come out of that. The flip side is not everyone wants to live on a rural property. And one thing a lot of people don't realize with a rural property, we talked about your primary place of residence being tax-free. Well, it's not on a rural property. It is for the 2 hectares or 5 acres. You can claim that space as your primary place of residence, but the rest of it is then subject to capital gains tax based on the land value and things like that. So there are different rules for different types of property, and that's something to be aware of. And again, rural property, I doubt very much would appeal to your lifestyle right now.
Not quite yet.
But
not yet.
When you eventually drop anchor and the next generation of Olorenshaws pop out and you've made your multiple millions, you'll be sitting back and enjoying things, living on the deck and having a great time. And it may well be something that does appeal. So they are the stages of life. And if you consider the whole journey of financial planning and wealth, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in other podcasts. It's about stage planning, and at each different stage of your life, different things appeal and are important to you. And each one of those stages can be embraced, and you can optimize from a money and investing point of view. I guess the key thing is, number one, just get started. And if you think about how old you were when you bought your first property, 21 or 22? 21. You've planted the flag nice and early. And the many smart things that you've done with that is the fact that your money is now growing for you with the organic movement in property prices. Whereas if you left it till you're 25, you miss out on 4 years of growth, and you might have a few more hedonistic stories to add to the mix, but you haven't got that foundation to run off. So get started yesterday would be the initial call. The rent is dead money. It is dead money. You don't own anything. And yes, there are tax benefits if you rent and things like that, but get a property and get started with that. And then you've always got that anchor point to help grow your wealth from it. And if you're able to then layer up on that, get your dad round to do a bit of painting, which I know you have. He was moaning about that the other day. I don't think you've paid him yet, have you?
No, I was supposed to shout him lunch, but I haven't shouted him yet. I'm sure I will. If you're listening to this, Dino, I will.
Yeah, no, Dean will really appreciate that. So, get someone in to help you. And I did the same thing when I bought my first place. The old man and my mum came down and sort of helped clean it up and and do the cosmetic stuff in there before I did the renovation I did. And so you're taking proactive steps to increase the value in the thing. So you've got the organic growth happening because you got started, and then you're taking steps to improve the value by undertaking certain things, renovation being an obvious one, and it's just sat there doing its thing. Whereas if you overthink it and never get started, this market continues to drive higher, and people are priced out because they just didn't get started early enough. And I think when it comes to principal place residence, the quicker you can get something that you can call your home, that's yours, that you're paying off with the bank or you own outright, the better. And then you're on literally well along the board of wealth creation, because you're always going to have a great asset behind you. There are plenty of other things you can do with your money, but that one is a non-negotiable, that you just have to get out of the renting pool and into it. And I know people will be listening to this that say, I can't afford to buy. You can, it's just not where you want to be. And you're going to have to forsake that affordability with maybe a significantly longer commute into work, for example. But then again, you might not need to go to work now, with work from home being the norm for so many companies. So that proximity that used to be so important, I think, look at town planning. Used to look at the world like it was a fried egg. Everything was in the yolk in the middle because you needed to be near the city. And now we're in a world that's scrambled eggs, where you can be virtually anywhere and do what you need to do. So that's made the demographics change, I think, in that argument for, well, I can't afford to buy in Bondi or wherever it is that you might particularly want to live. Then you buy where you can afford and get on the train like everybody else when they're starting out. Don't use it as an excuse. Use it as a lever to motivate you to get started and be on the game. And you can start seeing your money working for you, and eventually you'll end up where you want to be. But if you don't start, you'll never get there.
AB, great advice, great listen today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, anytime, Mitch. There you have it, guys. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Most importantly, hit the notification button, and we'll look forward to hosting you next week.